Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. On to panel number 3, which is going to be on tariffs and protectionism. So we're going to take a deeper look into those two items. And here to moderate, again, is our own Executive Committee member, Peter MacKay, who some of you heard about last night when he was introduced. Peter served in the Canadian Parliament for over 19 years, 10 as a cabinet minister in high-profile positions, including Minister of Justice, Attorney General, Minister of the Department of National Defense, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he was also the Atlantic Council Opportunities Agency Director. He chaired the Canadian National Security Committee and served on numerous cabinet committees for 10 years. He was elected as the national leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada. And prior to politics, he served as a public defender and a Crown attorney in Nova Scotia. Today, he has a law practice with the oldest Atlantic Canadian law firm, McGuinness Cooper. He also serves as an advisor with Deloitte Canada on economic development, industrial government, and defense projects. And recently, he took on a lead role for Arctic Strategy. So here to lead this panel, I'll turn it over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and what a pleasure to be here in Cleveland, Ohio, and to hear from so many of our American friends and colleagues. I just was back at our hotel room for a second. I came back and we were talking about bumper stickers last night, and I saw the greatest bumper sticker I've seen. It said, "The Great Lakes, salt-free and no sharks." And coming from Atlantic Canada, we're seeing more and more great white sharks coming up our coastline, so that caught my attention. We're really fortunate to have such an esteemed panel to continue this discussion. And I'm going to give brief introductions so that we can get into the meat of the sandwich. But to my immediate left, I have Lorraine Tanos, who comes to us via Canada, but is working here in the United States and has held numerous roles over the last number of years, but currently is the president of the Canada-U.S. Business Association, worked for a time at Canada Border Security. And to her left is Dan Utso, who is a senior counsel with the firm Thompson Hine. He's president of the Ohio Canada Business Association. I'm glad we have an emerging theme here of a number of Canada-U.S. associations, and the more the better. And to his left is Dan Dilkens, who's the mayor of Windsor, Ontario, which is, of course, an esteemed and storied position and city in our country, the largest land crossing, where I think the average is still over $1 billion a day. Is that as of today? We're still at $1 billion.
Still very big.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so when we've heard from previously Mayor Bradley, the municipal component of this trade dispute is really where so much of the proverbial rubber hits the road, and that's not just talking about our auto sector. There is the immediate fallout and the individuals and the businesses and the associations that are feeling perhaps the biggest shock at these early stages. So Lori, perhaps I'll turn to you first, and maybe you can just give us a few opening thoughts for the conference on the impacts that you're seeing, and based on your history and experience with the border in particular.
Certainly, thank you, and thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. So I have a few different roles. I am president of the Canada-U.S. Business Association. It's based in Detroit, Michigan, but I also am vice president of government relations for Russell Farrow. It's a Kuehne+Nagel company, so we handle movement of goods all throughout Canada and the U.S., and then I'm a business immigration attorney with my own firm in Windsor. So I have a few different lenses that I am seeing seeing what's happening right now through, and the good and the bad of that is that, you know, in my shoes, we see these types of things, and the first gut reaction is we have to find a solution, because we have to keep the movement of people and of goods going across these borders. So what we're seeing immediately, though, right now, especially with the recent restrictions on Canadians who now have to report when they are entering the United States for more than 30 days, that has caused a lot of confusion. It's caused a lot of difficulty. So I know we're talking about the tariffs, but the two go hand in hand, because we have so many Canadians that do travel for business and stay in the United States for longer than 30 days. So apart from the snowbirds, we've got a good group of people who have companies and who live and work in the United States and travel back and forth. So that impact is causing a lot of Canadians to say, hang on, maybe I should be selling my homes, maybe I should be rethinking my business operations, because this is a first. Now, we're exempt, we don't need fingerprints, which is great and wonderful. However, the fact that this just crept in the news and just crept upon us in the last couple of months has been worrisome. From the trade side, we're seeing a lot of companies who are saying we've got to rejig our supply chains. How are we going to restructure things so that we can make sure that we can stay afloat and not having to lay people off? So there's a lot of fear going on right now, and what I'm seeing is that people are in war room planning mode and trying to figure out their next steps.
Thank you for that. Dan, what are your sort of initial impressions of how this is impacting cross-border trade, clients that you're dealing with, businesses that are part of your association?
No, well, thank you, and thank you. It's a privilege to be here with you, and I had a very long-winded, being an alum of both Case Western Reserve and our brothers and sisters at Western Ontario and this institute with Jim Peterson and Governor Blanchard, who just continues to defy age. I mean, the guy looks younger than when I first met him 30 years ago, but and he's been a mentor to me. But I'll spare all of that, just because there were so many handshakes and hugs when we came in here. This was like Tinder for nerdy trade lawyers. Which reminds me, with comments like that, the views that I expressed today are my own. They don't reflect the views of Thompson Hine, and I do serve as Canada's honorary consul to Ohio, so I'm not reflecting the views of the Canadian government. Go talk to Consul General Byrd or any of the other Canadian government officials, or go yell at Stephen DeBoer, who's now quasi-retired, and what some of the Canadian stuff has had. But I do want to just say something before we get to the tariffs, and Laura Dawson, our great friend, touched on this morning, is how we got here. 25 years of doing Canada-US on the ground here in the United States. I don't want to burn too many calories on that, but every speech that every consul general or minister or ambassador has ever given on behalf of Canada here starts with our defense partnership, fighting shoulder to shoulder. And I think what folks started to really question here in the United States is when first of all, we didn't promote that a lot over the last few years and post-COVID and pre-COVID. And so I think there was a failure to educate on that, and maybe some of the facts on the ground. With Peter, you're here, and Stephen and others that can speak to the Canadian defense readiness, and particularly in the Arctic, is a concern for the United States, and NATO funding, et cetera. The border, which His Worship and Lori, and for the Americans in the room that may not know, I'm not saying that in a religious way. Mayors in Canada are called Your Worship. So I spend a lot of time with our U.S. mayors, and right here in northeastern Ohio, we've taken our mayors up to Ontario last year. Lisa Barnrow and the gang, Mayor, you were up there as well when we went up, and we'll be in Quebec City in a few weeks. But on the border, the unilateral shutdown of the Canada-U.S. border by Canada during COVID was certainly something that caught a lot of attention here, particularly for those of us that spent 20 years saying we run this border together. And that was a concern, just because folks north of the border were concerned about maybe who was in the White House at that time. And we just have to do better, is the bottom line. And that's how we got here, right? We dropped the ball. We have to admit that as the Canada-U.S. community. But two things I think are true is, number one, as others have said, I think Stephen mentioned it earlier, we can't make America great again without Canada and Mexico. It's just the way ally shoring is the way that we are going to compete against the world, including China. At the same time, it's up to our allies to also live up to those expectations, including us, right? But Canada on defense side of things, and Mexico, it was just, there's no way that you can recruit Chinese investment in the automotive sector to land in Mexico and didn't think that was going to be a problem, right? When we have full-scale Chinese investment into Mexico and thinking that that was not going to raise the attention of both the Biden administration, who voiced their strong objections to it, as well as the Trump administration, if you know the rhetoric. So I'll just get off my soapbox there for a second and turn into, I think there's really three R's that we need to think about right now. We went from rebalancing trade, right, in the first Trump administration. The Biden administration continued all of that. When we put tariffs on China and renegotiated USMCA really wasn't about Canada and Mexico, it was about China. It was about China using Mexico and Canada as backdoors. And so we raised those rules of origin, and who were the biggest beneficiaries of both USMCA and the China tariffs? Mexico and Vietnam. Because many of we put 10% tariffs, and Stephen and Laura outlined the tariffs, which I was thanking God when they went through the tariff list, because that's all I talk about all day long is that list of tariffs. So I was like, thank God I don't have to do that at 2 o'clock. But when we had those tariffs in 18, 19, 20, going into that period, the idea is it wasn't so much bringing manufacturing back to the United States. USMCA was about stopping the manufacturing we had from going southbound. So keeping those tool and die makers in Windsor, keeping them here in Youngstown, where I grew up, stopping that, encouraging a new flow for the newer technologies here, and then bringing that stuff that was in China to countries where we had more influence, like Vietnam, Mexico, et cetera, because we just don't have a lot of tools, and we saw that on Wednesday. When you go put 125%, it's a total of 145% tariffs on China. What did China do? Started flooding fire sale on T-bills because they're holding all of our debt, right? And that was coordinated with Japan. I mean, I think there's pretty significant evidence of that. So that's the retaliation that other countries did, not targeting certain congressional districts. They said, we got your debt, we're calling your bonds, or we're going to sell them. So the idea was, let's get that critical manufacturing into those countries. So then during COVID, that all continued, and then what just happened? We put these tariffs on now, and we can get into some of the specifics. But what companies are dealing with, and this is what our companies are first, is what's coming next, right? When we were doing briefings for companies in September, October, and November, I can tell you, first of all, when I was running up and down Wall Street and Bay Street, nobody on Wall Street or Bay Street believed the president was going to put tariffs on. And we're saying, I'm telling you, he's going to put tariffs on. There's never been a president in human history that wanted to put tariffs on more than President Trump, right? William McKinley's monument is in Niles, Ohio, an hour from here. He believes in the William McKinley basis of running the economy, right? And Wall Street and that's why we saw the equities reaction that we saw, is that the markets didn't price it in because they thought it was a threat. And we said, yeah, it's good, it's a threat, it ain't an empty threat. If he doesn't get what he wants, he's gonna put tariffs on. And that's of course what happened, and I'll quickly wrap up here. The second piece was when we talked to companies were saying, okay, we went through this the last time, we're ready. Right, because we've complied with USMCA, we've done the China tariffs, we've leveraged out of China, or we've hedged out of China. We've been through COVID. We know what our sourcing is. We've been dealing with forced labor, and we're like, I know, but this is going to be much bigger than last time, and that's what companies are dealing with right now. And then, of course, the uncertainty. Everybody's in holding pattern. You said it perfect. There's a war room. Everybody's got a war room right now. Like what projects can we go forward on right now? If you're buying real estate, people buying dirt, they're still buying dirt. But we have one of the largest construction practices in the country. I can tell you right now, nobody knows how to price any of this right now. And so we're gonna see delays there. And then companies, I go in and we talk to the administration every day. We've been advocating on behalf of Canadian companies and Mexican companies, and we can talk more about this administration does things differently, obviously, but you have to know how to talk to this administration, and we've, I think, been pretty successful in that. But we had to learn how the president makes decisions, and it's not the normal way. We'll certainly say that. But if you understand it, you can actually navigate it and educate them, and get to a point where you can actually do things. But I will tell you this: when it comes to this administration, for the companies that are saying, look, we can't just get it, it's only in China, it ain't gonna work. That message will not sell. They'll say, too bad. You're the ones that, you did this, it's your problem. But what I'm worried about are the companies that are like, look, we've already done everything you asked us to do. We got out of China, we complied with USMCA, we're sourcing from countries around the world. We just don't make this here. Either we can't because it's coming out of the ground, or it's coming out of the water, or only this country has it, right? So I think that's where you will eventually see some type of remedies around that, and we saw that already with energy and some critical minerals and some things used in energy refining in Annex 2 on the reciprocal tariff list. The next are going to be, the question's going to be, what about those folks that did do ally shoring, that did go into Canada, Mexico, et cetera? Are they, in other countries around the world, are they going to, is there going to be relief for them? Because that's the #1 issue we're confronting right now is, Dan, we would love to bring this to the United States, we just can't. There's just nobody to do this. And so what do you do at that point, right? And then the rest of it is, then the rest of what we do all day long as a lot of companies, it is amazing how many contracts didn't allocate tariff risk, right? You know, everybody was dusting off force majeure and all of their contract language. The reality is force majeure isn't very helpful to you right now. And what we do, it is a myth that the consumer bears the price of the tariffs. Because if I'm doing my job, we're working out deals so that the companies, so it depends on who you define as the consumer. Is it the person purchasing it on the shelf? Probably never makes its way to you, candidly. Because the consumer, the customer, you and I are only gonna bear so much cost. What we're doing is allocating that cost between the parties, right? And so even the big bad automakers, right, that always push everything down to their suppliers, like the suppliers are the ones that get hit the hardest. And you're going to see suppliers down the chain are going to be the first ones declaring bankruptcy and insolvency because they can't pass that cost on to anybody. But even the OEMs right now, the top of the chain, the automakers, they're saying, you know, we got to split these costs, which is unheard of actually in the industry. But you know, everybody's saying that, like, look, let's just work this out. We got to get through this for the next 90 days. So there's all of that kind of horse trading going on right now, and that's where we spend our lives. A lot of what we saw, I'll end here, a lot of what we saw this week, I think, has the uncertainty alone, just how do we plan around all of this? And that's the war rooms that we're in, and they're asking us, like, what do you think? Well, I could tell you this, like, we know July 9th, and there's a lot to do before then. By the way, there's a lot more coming. And so I'll give you the perfect example. Annex 2 of the reciprocal tariffs are all the things that are exempted. So there's some energy resources in there. It's funny, that energy resource list changed 3 times because the first time they did it, it didn't have crude, natural gas, and other things. Everybody's like, you guys forgot some big ones on the list. And then we made that list longer because we threw in any kind of steel and aluminum that we use in refining and pipelines and everything else. We threw in some critical minerals. That was kind of nice. And so that fit the definition. But now there's copper products, semiconductor products, lumber products, and pharmaceutical products. And everybody's like, wow, isn't that great? Those are exempted. All my semiconductor guys are like, man, it's great. We're on Annex 2. How do we move everything to those codes? The only reason they're on the list that they're getting exempted from the reciprocal tariffs is because that's the next round of tariffs. Like, they're telling us what's going to be in the next round of tariffs. It's all on that list in Annex 2. So contrary to popular belief, there is a plan. Right? There is a well kind of designed plan. It's just when it gets to that last decision maker, things usually go off the rails for a little bit. So that's where that's uncertainty. And so we're trying to lay out timelines and plans for our companies. But until we have that locked down, and we're going to see some deals, I think, cut very soon with Israel, Vietnam. Those will be the first out of the gate, in my opinion. And we can talk more about broader implications. Like one of the things that kind of keeps me up at night right now is it's wonderful that the European Union is coming to the table as the European Union, but that is going to be a very sticky set of negotiations across the board. So what happens when the president says, you know what, I'm just going to cut a deal with my buddy Victor back in Hungary and my buddy in Poland because I really like what they're doing in Ukraine? And how long will those member states be able to hold out from their populations. And then you could potentially see an unraveling of the European Union through this if it goes in that direction, because the EU, what you saw in the EU on electric vehicles was kind of a template for how you divide and conquer the EU on certain things. So there's a lot to do. There's a lot to do in a very short period of time. And that's before we even get to things like Chinese shipbuilding and others. It is difficult to express in the very short period of time as how much they have done in 80 days, almost 80 days. There's executive orders, 3 or 4 every day that come out, but unleashing America's energy, regulatory reform, permitting. And I've said now I'll finish 5 times, but now I'll actually finish. But the finishing is, if you talk to the administration, what they'll tell you is the lesson they learned last time was they didn't go big enough. It's almost like the Obama administration after the Great Recession and the recovery. We didn't go big enough, and we gave way too many exclusions, right? And so that's the lesson that they took. Now that's that move, but they also got a dose of reality this week, which is you can only go so far before your trading partners say that's enough. And it's not the retaliation from Canada, candidly. Ohio was like the hit list on the retaliation list from Canada. Why? Because JD's from here. Excuse me, the Vice President of the United States. So you look, it's every product coming out of Procter & Gamble, Whirlpool, Owens Corning. It's all their stuff. Smuckers. The retaliation list is jammed, as we always joke, right? But it's because they're targeting this state, but that's not really moving the needle there. What's moving the deal is I have to laugh. I think it's the Europeans and the Canadians have been running around with their hair on fire. You know who's dealt with the president most effectively is our Asian partners, because they don't treat it with emotion. It's purely transactional. And they said, Japan said, I came and we offered our investments from our Japanese companies are coming in the United States. We've offered to buy a bunch of LNG, and we're trying to work with you on tariffs, because we almost had a deal with Japan the last time in the first Trump administration. We're willing to work with you, and you're still hitting us with 20-odd% tariffs? Yeah, we're selling our T-bills. Then we'll see. Now we'll go to a negotiation. And that's what the Chinese did as well. So that should be a comfort that there is a guardrail on the outside. It also should scare the hell out of us, because it confirms the message, which is there's only so much we're able to do as the United States now when we're carrying this much debt, right? And that is a huge function of the rest of the administration on what they're doing. So I've gone on long and rambling, but it's kind of the summary of what we're seeing after several months now of activity, and we could talk more about the specifics on how to negotiate with this administration, because they can be educated. We've educated them on energy resources. The 10%, when it dropped from 25 to 10%, there's a lesson there on how to go about doing this. And there's a number of other examples. The other thing is there's also a number of things that we've seen this week, just as you look at how it shakes out. We've put a lot of pressure on China, but we've also given some favorable treatment to China vis-a-vis our US companies. When you kind of layer in how the tariffs are stacked, it ends up with some really absurd consequences. So that's all going to be shaken out over the next few weeks as well, or months. So with that, I'll stop, Peter. I know I've gone on too long, but that's kind of the summary of where we are.
That's an amazing amount of information, just to take it in, and it's good. One of the takeaways that I feel is that you believe there is a plan. It's a kind of surreal situation to see the president come out kind of like Moses on the mountain, big chart, because nobody can really discern what that means. So that is helpful. Your Worship, Mayor Dilkens, from the Canadian perspective, and Dan mentioned sort of taking the emotion out of it, that's been hard for Canadians. And it must have been hard in your city in particular, because it felt like our best friend sucker punched us. And I don't think, even with knowledge of the last Trump administration, anybody expected him to come at us as hard and as fast. And so that is still being sort of percolated, I think, in Canada. And it doesn't help that we're in the middle of an election and a leadership before that. It probably hit us at the most vulnerable period imaginable. But how are people starting to sort through some of what Dan has described as how do our businesses navigate these waters? How do we, as a country, try to get out of the line of sight or the ridicule of the president? Because that is also very jarring to see China and Canada taking the brunt of this early part of the administration vis-a-vis tariffs?
So driving the emotion, and Dan made a lot of good points, but driving the emotion in Canada for sure is a continued and ongoing threat to make Canada the 51st state. It's the only country the President of the United States has threatened to take over. And yes, he's talking about Greenland. Maybe that'll happen. I guess we're not the only one. Greenland, he's sending JD there and sending others there. But we share the world's longest undefended border. And we've had this relationship that's gone on for hundreds of years. But I can tell you Canadians in my city are in shock at the thought that the United States, our closest ally and best friend, is posturing to possibly make Canada the 51st state. And so every action taken against Canada is seen through the lens as something that will destabilize the Canadian economy such that we eventually just put our hands up and say, please take us, United States. We can no longer pay for our health care or other social services or supports that we rely on as a nation. And so what has happened here, and I've described it to many folks, I worked at our Canadian consulate in Detroit during 9/11. And I remember very clearly 9/11, you all do as well. And I don't recall another time in my life where Americans were more American and wrapped themselves in the flag, and you were literally under attack. And it was the greatest show of national pride and a coming together in the United States that I have ever seen. And it has evoked that sort of feeling in Canada. And Mike Myers, of course, coined the theme "elbows up," so that's taken over as a narrative. But it's brought folks together for rallies in the country. We've had rallies on the U.S. in Windsor and in Detroit, people showing support for one another. So it's that sort of comment that underpins a lot of the way Canadians receive the message being delivered by the President. On the auto side, the City of Windsor, I'd like to say, for those who haven't been there or don't have a great perspective on the Windsor-Detroit relationship, from my office at City Hall to my favorite Thai restaurant in downtown Detroit is 9 minutes door to door. And we will just go over for lunch from time to time. And so it is very, very close. And that proximity drives business activity, it drives human relationships, and a place like ours it certainly feels the pain when COVID comes and the border is closed, hard stop. We feel the pain differently than many other places in Canada because we rely on that access to the United States for so much of our daily activity. And so on the business side, it's been really interesting, and I would say that in the first term of Donald Trump, we got used to sort of the shock and awe, the comments that you had never heard a president make or the style in which it was delivered. You hadn't heard that before. And so we became accustomed to the shock and awe and the sort of random things that would come out of his mouth. And so that isn't surprising us. But the thought that facts don't matter anymore is really troubling for us. It's troubling for me, but it's troubling for a lot of folks. And I think Mayor, I'm not sure if you mentioned the whole issue with fentanyl and that first conversation where it was border security and fentanyl, and that was the rationale for applying tariffs. And I said, well, listen, throw away the Canadian statistics. Americans do not trust Canadian statistics, please. Go to your own U.S. Customs and Border Patrol website and let's pull up and look at the fentanyl that's crossed from what they call the northern sector into the United States, and it was 1/3 of 1%. But you need to understand that the northern sector is more than just land border crossings between the United States and Canada. It's also if someone flies from Amsterdam into Detroit Airport and fentanyl is seized at Detroit Airport, that gets captured in the northern sector stats. And so how the hell is Canada responsible for people flying in drugs to the United States directly to an airport? So we know the facts don't make sense, right? And border security, again, we looked at the numbers, and I can go through the numbers, but believe me, just all of you are smart folks. You turn on the TV, you see the flood of people crossing into the United States from the southern border. I can tell you it was about 10,000 people last year that crossed irregularly from Canada into the United States. It's dwarfed by the 2 million people that crossed at the southern border. And so when that was happening, I'm sitting at City Hall, I'm looking out my window, and I'm saying, well, this is so preposterous. Who is buying this? Who is buying this nonsense? And ironically, in my city, at that time when that conversation started, I had 750 refugees living in 2 hotels overlooking the Detroit River and the skyline in Detroit, who had crossed illegally into the United States at the southern border, made their way up to Canada through Roxon Road, And there were tens of thousands that were distributed to different communities in Canada. At our peak, we had about 2,500 in the city of Windsor, and slowly our immigration and refugee system is processing and adjudicating the claims, and the folks are being either sent back or allowed to stay in Canada. So we knew it was just bunk. It didn't make any sense. And then, to the mayor of the auto capital of Canada, moi, I hear the comment that Canada has stolen. We have stolen the auto sector from the United States. The auto industry was stolen, the parts sector was stolen. And I said, oh my God, is this really where we're going? Because 1965, before I was born, we actually agreed to something. Canada and the United States agreed to the Auto Pact. And we didn't steal anything. We actually built this remarkable industry together. Canada and the US built it together. And then in 1989, we started the free trade agreement between Canada and the United States, where we removed tariffs and duties on most goods that cross back and forth. And at the time, folks in my community were saying, the union specifically, saying, oh my God, we are going to bleed jobs. Everyone's going to move to Mississippi and Alabama and low-cost jurisdictions in the United States. And it's going to be a catastrophe for Canada because notionally we had higher wages and salaries. And so what happened after 1989? Did we bleed a lot of jobs, and did the sky fall, and do we have all sorts of problems? No. GDP grew. It actually increased employment, it increased productivity. There were some shifts, of course, there were some shifts back and forth, and business found the most productive place to build what they build and to make what they make. So much so that in 1994, we signed something called NAFTA. And we added Mexico to the equation. Same conversation. Oh my God, we're going to lose all these jobs to what we all know is a low-cost jurisdiction down in Mexico. We have to be on guard. We have to fight this. There has to be, something that is done. We have to stop this in its tracks. But it proceeded forward, and guess what? We grew GDP again. We increased the size of the pie. It was good for everybody. Were there shifts in the economy? Absolutely. There were shifts. There were winners and losers between jurisdictions, but there were shifts. And then we fast forward to USMCA, started in 2018, signed and became effective in 2020 under Donald Trump. And you probably spoke about this morning, that it was this president that claimed it was the best trade deal ever. And it did increase content for automobiles. We thought that was a good thing. It was good for the North American industry to increase the North American content. And guess what? It's been highly productive. It's been a well-implemented trade agreement. And you know what? Where we have friction with our trading relationship, whatever, if it's an auto or anything else, we've built in dispute resolution mechanisms to solve the issues that we have both used. All three countries have used them. And there are neutral third-party adjudicators who review, they come up with decisions. Sometimes we win, sometimes we lose, but at least it's fair, and it's something we've all agreed to. And so it is disheartening to think that we're in this particular point in time, that facts don't necessarily matter, and folks feel, I would say capital is parked. Capital is parked, that folks are just waiting to see what happens. Not entirely, and so it was ironic in our city, the day after Liberation Day, we had an announcement for a $300 million investment in an auto parts company that is manufacturing right next to our airport on 55 acres of land, hiring 1,100 people. And we said, are you guys going to continue? Like, do you actually want to have the event the day after Liberation Day? They said, hell yeah, we're going to have the event. We're still going. We're playing the long game on this. We're looking forward. It's going to take us a year to fit out this facility, to build it and fit it out. We're playing the long game because this will have to get resolved. And the thought that Canada is going to suddenly put everything on a ship and send it down to Asia or send it over to Europe, we may do a little more of that, and maybe Canadians have learned something in the process that we shouldn't be so reliant on the United States as our largest trading partner. Maybe we should diversify a little bit. But at the end of the day, it makes no sense. We share the world's longest undefended border. You are our largest trading partner. You will always be our largest trading partner. And it will be incumbent upon all of us to sit down and figure out how this works moving forward with a person who we know is creates uncertainty, is a stable genius, self-described, and we'll work with that. We'll work with that together, and we'll figure out what the trading relationship looks like moving forward, because it has to work. That we have to do something to make it work, and it has to work, and together we will. It's going to be choppy between now and the midterms, and maybe now in the next 3 years and 9 months.
That's terrific, Drew, and very diplomatic. Well put. I must say that it's been interesting, to say the least, to watch how various jurisdictions in various parts of our country have reacted, and understandably, they've reacted differently, and different sectors, of course. Drew, you and Dan both referenced security, and I'm going to come back to your experiences, Lori, but it's interesting to know, just as a reminder, 9/11 was invoked. And on 9/11, as an example of the important bilateral security relationship, it was actually a Canadian who was in the chair in Colorado Springs as part of that bicameral control. And it was a Canadian that decided to shut down the airspace over North America. That is the level of trust that existed between the Royal Canadian Air Force and the American Air Force, and the overall decision-making in the command chain. And, you know, I could reflect on the relationship we had coming out of Afghanistan and going back much, much further. Other than that little dust-up in 1812, we've been on the same side of the battlefield throughout our history. And so security has been invoked on a number of occasions, as we know, particularly vis-a-vis fentanyl, illegal migration, all forms of contraband at the border. But reflecting on that, if you will, Lori, there is always a grain of truth in terms of the criticisms and in terms of the need to change. And I think for Canada, we didn't need to be told, but we were complacent. And there are certainly, to this day, more efforts, more resources, more attention that need to be paid vis-a-vis, yes, the border. The Arctic is a whole other discussion and a major concern for Canadians as well as Americans. But talk a little bit about that border. And I guess it's one of the mythologies, and it's become a turn of phrase, but it's not really an undefended border. This is a border that is heavily guarded on both sides.
On both sides.
Not by military, but by specific border responsibilities. And at that border, there have been significant investments made. And you saw both the before and the after. If you could talk just a little bit about that, because I think it's also reassuring to know that Canada has responded, and quickly, frankly, to make the American administration feel that we are responsive.
No, those are great points. And so I am at the border 2 to 3 days a week with my clients, and I've seen a transition. So much like His Worship, I was a Canada Border Services Agency Customs and Immigration Officer during 9/11. So I saw what happened before, and then I saw what happened after. Being at that border 2 days a week during COVID, after COVID, then again prior to this administration, and now after, I can say that, and I don't work for CBSA anymore, but I will say that they have ramped up. They have listened. They have heard. We are seeing. I am seeing with my own eyes on a weekly basis, to your point, Your Worship, the number of illegal immigrants who entered in the U.S. from the southern border, who enter now at Canada, who are sitting there, and I'm literally right next to them, a bench of them, being taken back to the United States, saying, you know, we are listening. We are doing what we can do to better scrutinize who should be coming to Canada, how they should be coming to Canada, and follow the same process that everybody else has to follow. So yes, that's definitely one thing. We've got Black Hawk helicopters at various ports. So there has been a significant increase in security, but also in realizing where some of our fractures might have been, and working towards solving them. And I see that in action on a day in and day out basis, and I think it's only going to increase. You know, much like and I was one of the biggest outspoken critics of us shutting down or restricting our border during COVID. But the one good thing that it did is it let us see what we were doing wrong, because there was a lot of things that we were not doing right. And so we cleaned up our act, so to speak. And I think that's what's happening again right now. So,
and looking for shafts of daylight and sort of positives here is increased technology, for example, data sharing, You mentioned some of the, what you would call hard infrastructure, helicopters and personnel and dogs. And is this a chance to make this the most modern and productive and thinnest efficient border in the world?
Without a doubt, Peter. So many years ago, I was asked to go to Belfast to work on the Brexit border. And the question that they had for me is, how do you in Canada and the US have a hard border, but that works so well? Because we either have snipers shooting at us, and these were their words, right? Or we have not had a border. So we don't know what that reality looks like, where there is a hard border, where there are officers on either side, where each country is managing its own security, but how do we work together? Because you are our example. And one of the many things that I explained to them is our Trusted Traveler program is a perfect example, both on the commercial side with FAST, on the traveler side with Nexus, that allows me or you as an officer to say, you are high risk, I'm going to focus on you. That data is shared with the US, right? We make a decision together on if I'm going to get a Nexus or not. Further to that, with the perimeter agreement in 2021, we have exit entry data. So the US can see when somebody's come in and out through Canada, and Canada can see that information too. That data intelligence sharing has changed the way that the intelligence officers and units within both CBP, DHS, and CBSA and CSIS make their decisions, right? So, and to me, you're right. I think we're just going to continue to see that. And if we really want to make a solid change here and say, what can we do different? It's exactly what you just said.
Just a very quick follow-on. Sorry, Dan, I'm going to come to it immediately. And this isn't a fair question because I haven't given you any notice, but a perimeter, a North American security perimeter, are we headed in that direction? Is this a chance for Canada maybe to lean in and say, not only are we ready to work more on our border, let's talk more about the collective of North America?
I think we should. I mean, to me, if we all have the same common concern, which is China or outside influences or outside interferences, and I've done a fair bit of work between Mexico, the US, and Canada. I live in Canada half the time, and I live in the US half the time. I have an office in one country, an office in the other. I literally have one foot on either side of the border. To me, I see it as one unified front, and we are going to be more competitive if we can have common, and we started that, Dan, way back when with the RCC, with the, modernizing and aligning our regulatory regimes. To me, I think that would be the best play that we could do right now. But I've spoken enough, so I'll...
Dan, feel free to jump in.
No. I think, look, I think, and you were a leader on that, Peter, and there's a lot of border expertise here, Chris, and of course the mayor and Laura and many others along with Lori, and that was the direction we were heading. But I just want to flag a few points on the border. I mean, I've spent my life doing Canada-U.S. border work, and I want to be clear, like I've dedicated my life professionally and personally to Canada-U.S., but we have to be honest about the situation, right? And the reality is we dropped the ball, right? I mean, we were headed in that direction, and COVID hit, right? And I think some of that was, well, it wasn't just COVID. We had the USMCA, and the good news is all the homework on the border and beyond the border and others got put into the Customs and Trade Facilitation chapter of USMCA, and we were trying to just survive that rush, and then COVID hit. But I was struck when we saw the executive order on February 1st that came out on the border and fentanyl using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And if you look at the three executive orders, China, Mexico, and Canada, the Canada one was pretty vanilla compared to the other two, the accusations. You could hear Peter Navarro and Stephen Miller's voice. And we were talking to the White House as they were drafting, and Canada was done first, China second, and the Mexico one came out like 5 hours later. And that's because you could see where Stephen Miller was putting his inserts in there, and you could hear it. It's kind of, if you've ever seen him in an interview and elsewhere, you know what his views are on these things. But I was struck by the citation about the fentanyl crisis on the Canada side. And it's a citation to, I think it was the University of British Columbia study, which is kind of a bunk study, really, to borrow your phrase. But they didn't need to go that far. You could go to an Auditor General report on ArriveCan. And I'm not talking about the app, but it says Canada has not funded the border. CBSA has always been an entity where the spirit is willing, but the body is weak in terms of actually, because there's not the money to do it. I mean, I've been to more border conferences where CBSA said we're going to do this technology, but where's the dough coming from, right? I mean, at the end of the day, so that's, and this is just what it is a wake-up call to say, now we need to fund these things. And I think you can say the same thing on some of the military readiness, but again, I'll defer to other experts there. But just, again, I'm a Canada U.S. guy, but you have to look at this from the Trump administration's perspective. We can talk till we're blue in the face how we're just talking about a small amount of fentanyl, but they'll be the first ones to tell you a small amount can kill a lot of people, right? Including the kids in our high school that my son goes to high school with. Every community's been decimated by this, particularly in states like that state north of Ohio that has the so-called university in Ann Arbor, Pennsylvania. I'm a proud Buckeye, so and so I'll leave the Spartans alone. But you know, Wisconsin and places like that. But we put the order on, and then what does Canada do? Arrests in British Columbia. Right? All of a sudden, there's these fentanyl factories in British Columbia that get. Mexico, major raids against the cartel. You know why the executive orders were delayed, that the tariffs were delayed on February 1st, and we had that confusion to February 4th? I'll tell you, we were talking to the White House on that Friday. Canada thought they had a deal on the tariffs. Mexico said we have a deal. And we got a call from the White House and said the president still has to talk to the president of Mexico. It was Friday at 4 o'clock. And then we were waiting, and we were waiting, and we were waiting. Saturday morning, I get a call from some of our friends in Texas who we were just with down in Laredo saying, you know anybody at the White House? President isn't taking the Mexicans' phone call. The president of Mexico needs to talk to like Susie Wiles or somebody. The president was using the oldest negotiating trick in the book, which is don't take their call until you get what he wanted, and he wanted two things. He wanted another raid on the cartels, and he wanted a meeting at Mar-a-Lago or the White House. And the president of Mexico said, I'm not getting Trudeau'd, I'm not coming to Mar-a-Lago, right? And the second thing was Sunday morning, you saw a raid in Nuevo Laredo on a cartel leader, and then the tariffs were off Monday morning. I mean, so it looks like chaos on the outside, but it was squeezing some other things. And there are others in the room that know more about the details around that. There were other concessions made, but you have to look at it from the US's perspective. Like, you're telling us there's not a problem, but we squeeze and you're able to go make some raids. You know, and the question is how much more can they squeeze? Right now we have 2 destroyers off the coast of Mexico that are launching drones into fentanyl facilities into Mexico. So people are saying, you know, I agree that the Mexicans have played this better than the Canadians in my opinion, but they've also given up a heck of a lot of sovereignty. Our drones are fighting, there's 16 military advisors advising the Mexican government right now. And they're raiding the cartels. We were with the Undersecretary of Mexico recently, and my Spanish is good, but my slang can be a little rusty depending on which part of Mexico or LATAM they're from. And I just said, how much more can you guys give? And he said, Danielle, if I give any more, I'm going to be murdered. And I don't think he meant politically, right? Like, they are taking very serious actions against the cartels. And all you need is to watch a Hollywood movie. That usually doesn't go well for the political leader that makes those moves in terms of their security. So that may be the way we get to a perimeter, but every concession we make actually looks like validation for the original argument, right? And so we have, you know, and so for these, what we're gonna see is that the scorecard on the fentanyl tariffs is fentanyl deaths per month. That's what the administration's looking at. It's not arrests at the border or anything like that. They're looking at fentanyl deaths in the United States per month. And we got a big problem because on our law enforcement tracking mechanisms, there's a 4-month delay on that tracking. So by the time it's reported nationally from our local law enforcements, so if I was Canada or Mexico, I'd be saying we got to find a way to get that data into the system faster. Like, we got to talk to the locals and get that up there, because that's going to be the scorecard.
And that's a really good point, Dan, that information sharing, I think, has been lacking. And, you know, putting aside political assassinations, it's also a political death sentence to look at this moment in time like you're capitulating, like you're doing it just because somebody is pulling your strings, particularly, I point out, in the midst of a federal election. And Mayor Dilkens, you're the only one here at this table in elected office. Do you agree with that? You mentioned, you know, the sort of rallying cry of elbows up. I'll make another hockey reference. In a political fight, even though it's not your first instinct, sometimes you have to drop the gloves. And that seems to be what both major leaders are doing right now. They're talking tough. But everyone knows that there is going to be a point in time when we get back nose to nose at the negotiating table, whether it's bringing forward USMCA for negotiation, whether it's broader discussions around security. There are things that Canadians, I think, would be quite willing to do, but the tone and the tenor of how it's being thrust upon us, I think, has been hard to swallow, especially in an election campaign.
Yeah, and the election certainly, the timing of this hasn't helped in Canada, but moving along, and I've said this a couple times, that we couldn't figure out where the goalposts were. Like, just tell us where the goalposts are. Where am I kicking the ball? What goalposts am I shooting through? The reality is, Canada didn't really know, not entirely sure where the venue is. Like, where are we driving to find the goalposts that we need to kick the ball through? And the uncertainty of the election certainly has made the possibility of a solution in the short term more complicated, obviously. And they seem to have moved the needle, saying we're going to meet both the President and Prime Minister Carney. We're going to meet once the election's done. And so from a Canadian perspective, it's interesting because 4 months ago, if you had said who's going to win the election in Canada, it was entirely certain that there would be a change of party in Canada. Now, because of Donald Trump and the tariff issue, the ballot question really has become who's best to deal with Donald Trump. And now the Prime Minister has been able to kick the ball past the election before they're going to sit down and negotiate. And so that question, I guess, is still sort of out there, and it really has changed at least the polls of who might win. But if I can go back to the security issue, I agree. And I say the world's longest undefended border. We have a series of fortified gates. We have technology in the air from time to time that is, flying over, and drones and certain pieces of technology, but it is just physically impossible to monitor every square foot of border between our two countries. And a bad guy that lands in New York City, a JFK, is just as bad for Canada as a bad guy that lands in Toronto. We need to find a perimeter approach, or continue to develop and evolve the perimeter approach that we have, and the intelligence sharing and the data gathering, and maybe take the next step. Maybe this is the pathway to take the next step, where we find ways to harmonize more, to allow greater freedom of movement between the United States and Canada. I don't know enough about Mexico and whether they're at a point where that makes sense to add them yet. But I would say that, going back to Donald Trump's argument about repatriating all sorts of manufacturing jobs, there are two fallacies that underpin, in my mind, his argument. The first is that there are hundreds of billions of dollars of capital just sidelined, waiting to be deployed, and everyone's willing to abandon the factories they have everywhere in the world, and they've got the capital ready to invest in the United States to open up a new factory. That's one fallacy. The other fallacy is that the talent exists. And Mary, you will know, every single foreign direct investment opportunity that I have sat down with in the last 11 years as mayor, every single one of them, the first question is, how can you guarantee that we'll have the talent to make our business successful? It is a global war on talent. And so we have this border that actually prevents people from moving easily for work purposes back and forth. And in my community, we have about 1,000 manufacturers in my community. We are a global cluster leader in tool, die, and mold. And so if the thought is you're going to repatriate the tool, die, and mold industry to a great extent back to the United States, it's interesting. Where are you going to get the people? Because it's taken 100 years of skill development to evolve to where we are in our community. And those folks do not have the ability to cross the border to work in the United States. Could you create special pathways and exemptions? Maybe, but then these folks are still going to have to want to move and uproot their families to move to a different country, which, we know some will do that, but not many. And so by looking at security and creating a framework that's perimeter based, I think you get the added benefit of being able to deal with the free movement of people, which is essential to the success of any business that is going to open.
And so the expression that I hear so often at gatherings like this is never waste a crisis. And Stephen DeBoer, who's with us, spoke very eloquently last night, as you just referenced, the importance of the history, the institutional connective tissue that's there. And is this, in the midst of what seems chaotic, a bull in a china shop that's brought its own china, we're faced with perhaps a historic opportunity to rethink, not rethink out of the box as Netanyahu referenced in terms of resettlements, but thinking out of the box as far as how do we collectively benefit, and not break too many of the things that have been the underpinnings of the success of this relationship. Do you have any thoughts on this as an opportunity if we're trying to shine a light on it?
Certainly. So just from a CUSLI perspective, one of our members, many of our members, so some are hospitals who employ Canadian nurses, and they repeatedly say wings of theirs would be shut down if they could not have those nurses in the United States. We have many educational institutions on both sides of the border. Right now, with everything that's happening, these students and these professors have this limited movement. So to me, if we are going to really look at this, what we want to do is say we are going to do everything that we can to give the best environment to grow our talent organically, because right now, to his worship's point, and I live and breathe this every day, I have to bring talent from outside of Canada, from somewhere else, to come and to teach Canadians. Here's how we do program logic control. Here is how we do human-machine interface, because we don't teach that in our schools, not in Canada and not in the United States, but they do outside. So for us, if we say this is something that we are really going to take advantage of, to your point, there are already existing infrastructures in place, like our educational systems, like our hospital systems, who are already building things together, making things together, sharing work talent already, and our regulatory systems are so similar that it would not, in my opinion, be such an outrageous proposition to go to where you're suggesting.
Thank you. Dan, do you want to weigh in on this? The concept of Doge has sort of been a central feature of the new administration, the Trump administration. It's been an election issue in Canada. How do we cut red tape? How do we expedite important resource products is the big debate in Canada. Talk a little bit about that. I mean, when we've titled this discussion North American Crisis, Dismantling the World Trade Order. All of that has a rather foreboding feel to it. But is it repairable? Is it something we can build upon, rather than look at this as, nuclear fallout?
That's a great question, and I started off saying there were a bunch of R words. We've gone from rebalance to reciprocal. We've talked about retaliation. We have to also note that part of the tariff structure is based on revenue generation to deal with our deficits. And we talked, I don't want to get too far afield from your question, but when the president first talked about an external revenue service, I was like, really? That sounded like a pretty Trumpy thing, right? Like, I can get with the president on Greenland. I'm not saying I agree with it. I understand the thinking around it. I understand the Panama Canal. I didn't really understand the whole Gulf of America thing. I get the political reasons, but are we really spending time on this? But I thought the External Revenue Service was that. But the reason why we're doing the External Revenue Service is because you can't pay for the tax cuts under our current system, the way that the bowels of government, how you move money around. So we're creating a new revenue collection agency for these tariffs that will then be able to spend the money in ways that will help offset the deficit. And or not the deficit, the tax cuts and things for reconciliation. So the other R word there is revenue, which should lead you to believe, no matter what the president says, those 10% tariffs for most countries are going nowhere. We will have 10% tariffs on, or a number that every country will have. And hopefully Canada and Mexico are not in that, and other trading partners. But there's another R word that, so I think, but I also think reconciliation from a U.S. stakeholder perspective. If you're in the C-suite now, right now, going back to your first question, Peter, was, what are companies doing? Companies are balancing, okay, it's a big math problem. Here's what my potential tariffs are, but we have to know what those are. But here's what my potential tax cut is, regulatory reform, permitting, et cetera. And how do I balance that, right? So when you talk to the White House, they'll tell you, you're only focused, Dan, on the tariff piece. Look at all the other colorful language that we're doing on the investment attraction. So unleashing some of the investment, and we'll see if it works. It's either going to work well or it's going to fail spectacularly. And we're going to see how that works. But there's another R word, revolution. I cannot emphasize this point enough, that these individuals that are running the show at all levels of the government believe this is a revolutionary moment in U.S. history. Like, this isn't just storm the Capitol kind of stuff. It is now or never when it comes to our relationship with China. I can tell you what happened Wednesday with the treasuries has just confirmed that point to them. And so we can talk till we're blue in the face about what we did as our Canadians and Americans stormed the beaches of Normandy. They don't care. They don't care. What they want to do is, what are you doing right now? And so the actions that I would say is, let's not spend time talking about manufacturing. You know, in Canada, US, we need to shore up the bases, which is, let's look at how do we look at this continent a different way, maybe on security, perimeter security. Let's look at our energy resources, where all three countries can call those domestic projects under their various domestic laws, which hopefully would facilitate, particularly in this country where we're gonna, looks like we're gonna not have a lot of regulation around permitting and things like that, move things through projects faster, right? And so that one country can't decide to turn off the spigots or block a pipeline being built underneath the Great Lakes. Let's look at how we're using our critical minerals. Let's look at potash things. That's where this administration is. So if we can look at defining things in new ways, and that way we don't have to deal with 3 different regulatory systems at the federal level when you get into the Great Lakes, 8 states, 2 provinces, et cetera, et cetera. That's where I think there's going to be interest in this group. If we're coming in there, I will tell you, anytime we walk in, they'll say, don't tell me about that car that crosses the border 11, 12 times in the assembly process. I don't care that when it goes into Canada and comes back with 40, that it comes back with 60% US content and 40% Canadian content. To his worship's point, we want that 40% here in the United States, right? And okay, that's their policy provision, you know what I mean? So I don't think we should burn a lot of calories on the manufacturing side of things. And the reality is, we got a lot of manufacturers in the room. I'm a manufacturer. I've grown up cutting steel my entire life, right? Manufacturers are going to go where there's the best opportunity for them to go, the best talent, et cetera. We don't need to design policy necessarily around that between the 3 countries, but let's lock down what we have. And that is a different model than the European Union. That's elsewhere, but where you can maybe look at things as these are shared resources, and that keeps the next group that may come in of nut jobs from regulating that way as well. So that's where I would be going with this, but I just don't know if there's the bandwidth to get there, or the politicalness.
I'm interested to hear from His Worship on this point, but some of the parts, and you spoke about this earlier, Dan, your opening, some of this isn't coming from Canada or the United States. All the instrumentation, for example, and I'm a Luddite, I don't get all of the new technology, but for washing machines, certainly for vehicles, for aircraft, there is a fairly significant portion of those parts that come from Taiwan or come from Poland. There's elements to this that are sort of washed away in the rush to condemnation on all sides of this discussion. Drew, your thoughts on where we go from here, I guess. Is some of this cross-border discussion, some of these exchanges that have existed throughout our lifetimes, and I love that the mayors are meeting in Quebec City. I love that we have such a presence from our municipal leaders here today. Those type of sort of below the federal level discussions, I think, are going to bear fruit over time, because yes, the administration may not want to hear that we, stormed Normandy together, but if China is storming Taiwan, or if things continue to go pear-shaped in the Middle East, or things get worse in Ukraine, that relationship will matter. As will, I'm quick to add, the sharing of intelligence and the prevention of attacks in North America. That is where it does matter that people in the Pentagon can reach out and call somebody in Canada. We need to, I think, burnish up our credentials on the security front, and why it matters then and why it matters now.
Amen. Yeah, and poor Stephen's holding up the questions sign and wants to take questions. Let me just say I agree with you. I think there's a way to do this, and I think, from a Canadian perspective, we should learn a couple things here, and there are a couple takeaways that we ought to really work on to make sure that we have a strong relationship moving forward. This is going to be a tumultuous time. It's going to be a difficult time. contrary to your comments about manufacturing, it does matter to me, and I'll continue to talk about a number of times parts cross the border, because I do think it matters, because we built it together, again. But if there's a policy change that has an impact on communities like mine, I know, based on what's built and based on the integration of a supply chain, that the thought of repatriation or dismantling of that is going to take much longer than the term of this president. And so I think we have to have a relationship, again, that's built on trust, that's built on mutual respect, something that we have had for post-1812. We've had that type of relationship, and I don't think it's over. Our Prime Minister made a comment, saying that those days of this type of relationship with the United States are over, and, it was very sort of campaign-esque. I don't feel that way. I think there is a pathway forward that is good for both countries. Let's include Mexico, good for all three countries, because they're an important part of the supply chains that we have built beyond automotive. And so if there are things we can do for security, we ought to do them. And we ought to look at our NATO targets. We ought to look at the Arctic, and Pierre Poilievre's talking about the Arctic and a base in the Arctic. I think that's crucial for our security, crucial for North American security, and it's our space, it's our land right now. We have to be a good partner, and if it's a concern to the United States, it ought to be a concern to Canada. It's not something we can just turn our head and think that it's going to go away. And so I do think there are pathways. I do think it's going to be very choppy waters. I think that there are so many parts, especially in the automotive world and probably in many other industries, that just aren't made here. So you're talking about developing brand new industry, wire harnessing being a great example. It's just not made here. And so can you repatriate that? Sure, you can. You can find a way to develop the expertise, but how long is it going to take you, and what's it going to cost? And so these are long-term plays. And we're kind of wrapped up in this short-term world because everything's coming at us fast and quick, and things are changing. I mean, I have to go to ChatGPT and say, what's the latest executive order, and what's the latest on tariffs here between Canada and the United States, and what applies and what doesn't apply, because it seems to be changing, and then there's layers. And so we'll figure it out. I am, as sort of dour as I feel like I've come across, I am very optimistic. I am very optimistic that we are going to fix this.
I don't think you come across dour at all. Not at all.
I feel like it, but I really am optimistic that we're going to find a pathway, because it's in our shared interest to find that pathway. And we have a relationship. I made a mistake a couple weeks ago. I spoke to a group of Oakland University students, and they were asking good questions, smart political science students. And they made a comment, and I said, well, picking on Canada is like picking on Switzerland, for crying out loud, right? And all weekend it bugged me. It was a Friday, and all weekend it bugged me, because when we hung up the Zoom call, I thought to myself, God damn it, it's not like Switzerland. We have fought with the Americans. We lost 160 Canadians in Afghanistan, avenging 9/11 and these other. It's not neutral. We have never been neutral. And so it hurts us. It hurts me as a Canadian to see what one person in the United States who has so much power and authority is doing to my country. And it hurts Canadians to feel like there is an attack, whether it is going to happen or not. It's the thought that this could happen. And I did a speech, a State of the City speech, about a month or 2 months ago. And in the speech, I had read a book on the War of 1812, and it talked about cannons being placed along the waterfront in Detroit, aimed at what was then Upper Canada. And I said, I can only imagine what the Canadians, not even really Canadians, but the people who lived in the place that we're standing now felt when they looked across the river and they saw cannons aimed their way. Mm-hmm. And although there are no cannons aimed our way today, the feeling must be the same. It must be the same as it was back then, where it appears like there is, someone is out for us, and at the same time we're looking, saying, we're just trying to find a way to make this work. Like, we are good friends, we're partners, we have shared so much together, we have such a shared history and integrated economies. Surely there's a pathway that doesn't require the type of misinformation and the type of posturing that is very aggressive, that is totally unnecessary. And so I am optimistic we're going to find a way, because we have to, and it's in our shared interest to do that. And all I can say is, the sooner the better.
Yeah. Well, altered, not over, I think, is perhaps a way to encapsulate that. And again, invoking Stephen's references last night throughout our history, the American national anthem was written out of that era. Our confederation as a country was accelerated because of the American Civil War. So we are so intertwined, and it's in our collective DNA. And I'm quick to add, just we all know from our personal lives, the fights in the family are very often the worst because of that emotion, because we know each other so well. The floor is yours. I'm going to open it up. We have some very capable, esteemed panelists here, and love to hear from you. Stephen.
Stephen DeBoer. A comment or an observation on fentanyl, and then I have a question about trade. On fentanyl, it seems like the U.S. approach, and this has been their drug policy for the last 40 years, is on supply. And so the thickening of the border on fentanyl seems to be around supply. It would have struck me that perhaps a better approach to address supply would be for the three countries to collectively go after China, where all the precursors are coming from. But nevertheless. But the thing that really strikes me is that the measures that are being targeted are around supply, but the goal or the measurement of the success is on demand. So that seems to be incongruous. And we're asking, the United States is asking Canada and Mexico to lower drug deaths in the United States, which are somewhat related to supply, with taking absolutely no measures on the demand side. And I would say, sitting in Canada, at best that seems misguided, but it also seems very imperial. It's like, you need to fix our demand problem here. And we're going to tell you what policy tools to use, which don't actually go very far to dealing with the demand problem. So this creates a real policy problem for Canadians and for Mexicans, because they're being told to take measures to solve a problem, and they're being graded in a way that's almost impossible to be successful. So sure, we can get more stats more quickly, but those stats can change for things that we do or do not do. So that seems to be, that makes it difficult to move forward. On the trade side, I can fully accept that perhaps what's happening inside the White House or the Department of Commerce is more organized than it appears on the outside. But what's missing is, what is the goal? Is it revenue generation? Is it to make America great again and all the manufacturing moves to the United States? Is it to cut deals? Because if the success is to cut tariff-free deals with other countries, then you've undermined moving manufacturing jobs to the United States, and you've undermined the revenue generation. So again, from a policy perspective, as you're trying to devise policies that meet the Trump demand, which one is it? And which one are we trying to achieve? Thanks.
Who would like to take a run at that? There's a lot.
Yeah, I'll take a run on both of them. The first one, I agree wholeheartedly with the sentiment, but I do think that the response you would hear on the demand side is, it's not necessarily demand, but it's domestic, right? Is part of the way we're going to stop fentanyl production, or maybe not necessarily usage, but the domestic efforts will be through sending really bad people down to El Salvador. And so I think the crackdown on MS-13 and others is part of that strategy, right? Is that the belief is that fentanyl is coming through those organized crime gangs and elsewhere that come primarily from LATAM. So the undocumented migration, we'll see. Look, we don't, to your point, we don't have a very successful history in the war on drugs, whatever phrase we want to use for that, and we'll see. But I think it's also tied in with the China piece. To the point, I think that they want to see coordination between the three governments, and the three governments have put that on the table. But this is tied into China as well, because there is a view among very senior people in this administration that this is a deliberate approach of China to destabilize the United States, is to send fentanyl into the United States and use Canada and Mexico to do that, and I think primarily Mexico. But there are reports from the DEA, from all three agencies, that show that these are trinational networks, or from China using the trinational platform. So that's what they believe. I don't know if it's going to work. I don't know, and I don't think, I agree with you. I don't think the scorecard is going to get us there, right? And I think that's why we have a USMCA exemption on the fentanyl tariffs, right? The fentanyl tariffs, while offensive to many people, at the end of the day, the impact as we go forward will be increasingly limited in the business community because of the, right now, I think the statistics are something like 60 to 65% are USMCA imports from Canada and the United States. I will guarantee you within the next month or two, you will see that number around 80 to 90%, just based on, because so much of it's in the crude sector and potash and things that were already at zero tariffs. On the last point, you asked the question on the strategy. Let's just be very clear that the ticket to any deal, in my opinion, will have a requirement that those countries put on the same tariffs that we have on China. Mexico has already agreed to do that. And we will see what Canada's response to that is, and that means all of. So we approached ally shoring in the last administration, friend shoring, you know, a very Sesame Street type way that we called it. But we're going to see if those countries really do want to do ally shoring and near shoring and taking on China the same way that we do. And that's going to be the ticket, along with a foreign entity concern provision, so that if a Chinese company invests in your country, they cannot take the benefit of the trade deal, which ironically is the same language that was developed for the Inflation Reduction Act. And so those are going to be the tickets. But Stephen, you made an excellent point. The U.S. Chamber calls it the trilemma of how do you do all three of those things, right? How do you encourage investment? How do you try to establish reciprocal trade and generate revenue? And the fact is, I don't think you have, I think the administration's position would be we don't maximize those all at one time, that it's kind of a sliding scale. But again, I'm not certainly endorsing the policy. I'm just saying my view is we have to understand it. Right, is that if we're going to go in and talk, I'm getting asked every minute of the day while I was sitting here, can you go talk to USTR? We just can't get this product, you know, here. And if it's somebody saying I'm going to import this product from China, like, no, I'm not going into USTR and asking for that. Like, I'm going to tell you, not because I'm saying no, I'm going to advocate strongly for my clients, but it ain't going to happen. They're just not going to let that happen. I'm telling you, you know, and we're going to have to deal with the consequences of that. But you know, that's where we are.
Great question, great answer. I'm trying to picture Grover and those guys going through one of these tariffs is not like the other. But it is interesting too, the idea of China factoring into so much of this, and I can't help but think out loud for Canada's purposes. There really is no choice. There's no choice between Canada working with the United States or working with China. And you know, we haven't touched on foreign election interference. We haven't talked on the pernicious effects of TikTok and all of that, because that's also, I find it, as a person with young kids, huge threat to the youth of North America.
Well, how would you do that, though? If I can just ask you, with two elected leaders in Canada, to your point, I thought you made a great comment on tenor and tone earlier. So right now, if Canada does that, it's going to look like they're conceding to Trump, right? So how do you see this playing out over the next few weeks? Like, you're optimistic, right? Well, we just heard it's the end of Canada-US as we know it. I got a feeling that may change after April 26th or whatever. So how do you go through?
They'll reel in a lot of that rhetoric, and we'll get back to logical, meaningful, substantive discussion. In my opinion, that's going to happen. We are getting down near the end, but we've got time for a couple more questions. Sir?
I watch Mexican TV. There's their Mexican news channel. My perception, which was that Dr. Scheinbaum and her security gentleman, Mr. Garcia Harfuch, initiated a crackdown before Mr. Trump was elected or sworn in. I don't doubt that he's on their tail, but I suspect that there's reason for more than good faith on their part. I'm trying to learn Spanish. That's why I watch the TV. My insight may be incorrect, but I think it's worth considering. However, I didn't hear the F word. The F word, which we hear from the Mexicans, is firearms. I would bet that Yankee firearms are finding their way into Canada, and Canadians don't have a sense of humor about that, but you haven't said anything about that. And like the Mexicans, that's a legitimate gripe on the other way.
I mean, it may not be heard, but it has been talked about for a very long time. I mean, there are boatloads of handguns in particular, 9mm, coming into Canada, and that's the issue. We've got this quintessential debate always about firearms in Canada, and it's a much different, we're disarming, duck hunters and collectors, as opposed to focusing on gangs, and it's handguns predominantly coming from the U.S. that are that problem. There's more of that flowing across than a backpack of fentanyl.
And the leading state for that's Ohio.
Yeah.
ATF will tell you the most of the handguns coming into Canada are from Ohio.
Yes. Sorry, yeah, please go ahead.
Did I mention that we share the world's longest undefended border? And I just think of the Detroit River. Just going down to the waterfront in Windsor, Detroit, on a day, where are we, in April now, 3 months from now, you will have 100 jet skis on a nice day like this, out on the water, moving back and forth. They have done documentary shows talking about the movement of drugs and guns between the United States and Canada. In fact, if you did an analysis of the number of criminal offenses in Canada that involved illegal firearms, almost entirely, it has to be almost entirely from the United States, it's almost 100%. It's almost 100% of firearm offenses in Canada are American guns from the United States have been brought in illegally. Yeah. And to Peter's point, I mean, it is remarkable the steps, especially the Trudeau government took to make life extremely difficult for law-abiding firearms owners, and really ignored the source of the problem. It's done nothing to actually eradicate the issues that we have in Canada.
The worst shooting in Canadian history, which happened just a few years ago in my province, and all of the guns involved were sourced from the U.S. And the use of drones now, too, to carry drugs and contraband and guns is also becoming a huge problem. Marine drones as well. Sorry, sir.
Yeah, I'm going to start a new business bringing Canadian Club over across the river. So anybody wants to get a piece of that early, give me a call. Mark High from Dickinson Wright. I wonder if you can, we've been looking days, maybe weeks down the road. Can anybody think about what this means for the USMCA renegotiation that's going to start in a year or in a week?
I hope it starts sooner.
Yeah.
That'd be the only comment I'd make. I think we should accelerate it. Because then you're dealing face-to-face with officials, and you can get past the sort of the rhetoric and what's the ground truth about what we really need to establish here. I turn to you.
I agree with Peter. I know you've got more.
Well, I think we're going to see the launch of the public consultations by the end of the month on USMCA on the U.S. side, but we have to look at what that is going to be. Is that you right now have Canada sitting there with 25% tariffs for fentanyl, 25% for steel and aluminum, 25% tariffs for auto, and 12% reciprocal tariffs if for some reason those would go on. Right, that was the number Canada got as a country specific. So the U.S. is going to come to Canada and Mexico and say, here's our asks. We want the China situation. We want foreign entity of concern. We want a domestic content provision, not just North American content in motor vehicles. We want a U.S. content. We want you to do something on dairy. We want you, Mexico, to do some things on the Great Tomato War that we've had between Florida and Mexico and give it to us now, or we're blowing up USMCA in 6 months. And so one of the great pieces of news of this week was USMCA became very valuable to keep Canada and Mexico exempted from the reciprocal tariffs, but it became very valuable this week. So the U.S. can just say in 6 months, there's a 6-month notice provision to blow up USMCA. And guess what? So last time, if we got rid of NAFTA, you would default to what's called most favored nation rate, 2.5%. That was always kind of the dirty little secret, like, yeah, if Trump blows it up, we'll still pay 2.5%, right? Now it's 12% at least, plus all those other tariffs that are in the chute. So it's a maximum leverage play. And so I think there is a vigorous debate going on in some circles as to, I think many of us are of the view, let's get it into the USMCA lane, but there are people cautioning, like, do you really want to go into a negotiation like that? at that point where you're losing some leverage. So it gets to the point that Peter and Drew and Lori as well made. What are you willing to give up in Canada? And that's got to be done after an election, right? You're not going to screw around with dairy in the middle of a Canadian election. Like, I'm not a Canadian politician, but I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen. And lumber is going to be tricky. We ring-fenced lumber last time, and it just wasn't. We kind of left that out of USMCA. But I always say, we're all trained to negotiate. As lawyers and elsewhere, you kind of stay on the issues on the table. That's not how this crew negotiates. They negotiate like Michael Corleone. It is we're going to settle all the family's business. So we're here in Poland, we're sitting across the table, the European Union, we're negotiating tariffs, but we're going to talk about Ukraine, we're going to talk about everything.
That's a lot of horse heads and a lot of
it's a lot of horse heads. That's a lot of dead horse. So, it's going to get bumpy, but we'll get there.
I'm conscious of the time, and Stephen, I'm going to close on a musical theme. Chris Sands started this morning, and that is that old classic, we are family. Or why can't we be friends, at least? So I want you all please to help me thank Lori Tanis, Dan Utek, and Drew Dilkins. Thank you very much.